And now you probably have all that pop up. If you haven't introduced yourself in the chat, feel free to do that now. As always, we'll have a free-flowing conversation. And if you want to participate, feel free to pop questions in the chat, and I'll take questions from there and build them into the conversation as much as possible. We'll try to end pretty much on time at 8:30, stop recording, and then just hang out and have a little bit more of a chat. And if you feel comfortable then to come off camera and ask questions directly of our guests, feel free to do so. But till then, I would ask everybody to stay muted, or I'll just mute you. If you have any feedback, any questions, any ideas for what we should do next and who we should invite, let me know. I'm Robin Romer. I'm the VP for Legislation for Oregon PTA, and you can reach me at legislation@Oregon PTA. And with that, we'll get started. I'll stop sharing. And it's my great pleasure to have on this episode 5, the Oregon School Board Association, represented by Efren and by Adrienne. And I would love for you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Robin. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here, and I know I have a few board members here as well, so thank you for joining. My name is Efren Zamudio. My pronouns are he, him, and I have the pleasure of serving the OSBA membership on the legislative team, working day in and day out to protect public education. I was born in Oregon. I'm a graduate of Salem-Keizer Public Schools. I also graduated from Willamette. Oregon is my home. I care about it so much, and I care about the education system that brought me before you today. So that's a little bit about me. I'm excited to talk with you this evening, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Adrienne Anderson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adrienne Anderson. I'm the newest team member that we're on the legislative team at OSBA. I'm originally from Illinois, but I am a proud product of public schools, and I've lived in Oregon for about 8 years now. So I'm really excited to be on this journey at OSBA and fight hard for our public schools and advocate for our students.
Thank you both so much for being here. We want to talk about 3 big things tonight. One is about some recent developments that happened over the summer. We want to talk about, second, about the role of school boards in school finance and the budget process. And then we want to take a look into the future, into 2025, and what's on the horizon there, and the advocacy that we need to do in 2025 legislative session. So let's jump right in and start. We're still in summer. Let's start with summer learning. There was a $30 million appropriation in the short session. There were some summer learning programs this summer. And last Thursday, people came together to talk about summer learning at a summer learning summit in Eugene. I believe the governor was there and you were there. What can you share?
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Happy to talk about that. So as we know, summer learning is one of the best investments we can make to get students back on track. And in the last legislative session, we went in with a $50 million ask for summer learning. The legislature only gave us $30 million. That $20 million made a big difference. It meant a lot of students not being able to be served, or districts across the state having access to those resources. So that's a disappointment, but there was one silver lining, and that was there was a language in that legislation that started this summer learning work group to develop a sustainable path forward to summer learning in Oregon. That work has been underway these past couple months, and we just had a summer learning summit in Eugene, where all the people in that work group came together, and a lot of folks who work on summer learning programming. There was board members there, superintendents. I had a few of my members there with me. And it was really a space to provide our insights and input as those summer learning priorities are finalizing towards a report. And it was a great meeting to just hear about some bright spots. You know, there's so much that we read in the news that is negative about education. And really that conversation was centered on how can we make high quality summer learning programming that not only builds students' academic achievement, but also helps them get to know what they want to pursue as a career, build relationships with their classmates, and really get connected to their broader community with hands-on learning. Governor Kotek was there and spoke, and really she emphasized that this is one of her top priorities in 2025, getting sustainable summer learning and after school a bill passed in the next session, and that is something that OSBA will be supporting as well. So it was really great. It was very energizing. I'm excited to see their full report on what those priorities and see how OSBA can support them in 2025.
Do you know when that report is due roughly? When shall we look out?
Yeah, I think they're finalizing it over these last couple months. That summit was really designed to, it was actually an unusual process. Usually they pull stakeholders together to provide input on this, and Adrienne and I know we're on a dozen of them right now. They changed this a little bit for an application process because they really wanted to get people who are doing the work to provide input on what it should be. And so this was designed to provide more community input or from partners like OSBA board members or others in advance of their completed report, which I think will either come out in September or early fall.
Thank you. One of the biggest news of the summer was the statewide agreement on the way current service levels, CSL, for schools are calculated. Can you just briefly describe why the CSL discussion is important and then maybe highlight some of the significant changes that have been agreed on?
That's a great question, and one that I talk about all the time. Funding, funding, funding. It's everything, right? So Lori Sattenspiel, who was formerly OSBA's longest serving employee, she still works with us as a consultant to support our legislative team ahead of 2025. But she will tell you that this was the first time in over her 18 years of service that OSBA ever had a seat at the CSL table. That is huge. What the current service level is, and I know we talk about it and throw it around all the time, it's a really wonky budgetary term, but essentially what the CSL is, which the state does for all of the state agency budgets, is what is everything that you did in the past biennium, the state budgets on 2-year cycles, what did you do in the last biennium, and what would it cost in the next? That is the current service level. So adjusting for inflation, rising costs, and all of those things. And that is a basis for the governor to contemplate for her governor's recommended budget that she delivers to the legislature before the long session, and also for legislators and legislative budget analysts to consider as they do their work on the final appropriation. So what we have been saying for decades is that current service level process is inaccurate. It does not fully capture the costs that school districts have from one biennium to the next. Again, CSL is not talking about, let's do summer learning, let's do this. It's what is the cost of the state school fund rolled up. The reason why it's a big issue in the past and why they maybe have not been open to hearing about our concerns is the state school fund is the largest appropriation out of the general fund that the legislature makes. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars. And even moving a little bit can mean that there are less resources for other areas. So the legislature and the governors in the past have preferred to have a lower number so they have more room to work with in the session. Because what they'll say is, okay, CSL might be low, but you always get more in session. The problem is we get more in session because we're focused on getting that number more accurate, which means that we can't advocate for things like summer learning or the high quality funding that we need. So what's changed in this past budget cycle, and really as a result of what happened in PPS with the first strike in Oregon's largest district's history, is Oregonians across the state, and I'm sure many of you saw, wow, the legislature was saying, we gave you the most money ever, $10.2 billion. Shouldn't you be happy? Don't you have everything that you need? And in the Portland teacher strike, what's happening in Salem and in so many districts, they're seeing that no, that actually was not the resources that students need. That is not what districts needed. And that made Governor Kotek look and see, how can I revamp the CSL process to maybe make it more accurate so schools have the resources that they need? And we went in a little wary, right? There's been fights on this for a long time, and we weren't sure if we were going to make any progress in that discussion, or if it would be, hey, we want your input, but we're still going to have a lower number in the end. That is not the case. What came out of that meeting was an additional over $500 million in what the governor will calculate as the current service level and incorporate in her governor's recommended budget. Again, that conversation is about what the additions will be, not what the full number will be. That number has not been released. It will likely come out this fall. But really, the few changes that were made, and I'll just name a few. One of them was the 49-51 split. So if you have $10.2 billion and you're saying, how am I going to split that up in 2 years, which is our biennium? The legislature, as they would disperse that money, would disperse it 49% the first year and 51% the second year, because costs rise in the second year. That is not how the CSL was calculated. So that difference of it being the 51% that is then rolled up into the state school fund versus a 50% or less is a huge difference. You're rolling up that number, then as you're rolling up, compounds over time. And so that little change added a lot, a couple $100 million or whatever it was. The second one was looking back. We know that the biggest cost to districts is salaries and benefits. It's 80 to 90% of most districts' budgets. It is the highest cost driver. If we didn't have an accurate calculation of what that would be, that resulted in a less allocation to the state school fund. So what was used in the past was a backward-looking look at salaries using a 20-year cycle, looking back. What the governor did this time is went back to the last 10 years and made adjustments there. So let's say they predicted in 2015 that salaries were going to be on average 2%. In actuality, they were 3%. That never got counted as the CSLs moved forward. So it was still the inaccurate number that was the actual average. They went back and changed that. All of that and a couple others resulted in $500 million. So this is what little small tweaks to a very big formula can result in a huge difference in that final number. And that's why we have been so angry with the process in the past, but why legislators maybe were not as open to that, because moving a little bit of those levers can mean a lot of money in the end. So the governor released that. We are proud of that work that we had there with our other association partners and the Oregon Association of School Business Officials to make that number more accurate. It is not everything. The governor has left the door open for a few more costs to contemplate before she releases her governor's recommended budget, and those are PERS costs. The PERS board released estimates of what the rising PERS costs would be. That is not the same for districts with side accounts. We are trying to make sure that those costs are included in the governor's recommended budget. The other two is unemployment insurance and paid family medical leave. We made progress with including the employer contribution to the paid family medical leave, but we were not successful yet in getting the costs associated with that. So if a teacher goes out on paid family medical leave, a district needs a sub to make sure that that classroom is covered. So that means paying for 2 people at once. That can be tens of millions of dollars across the education system. So we're trying to get those costs included in the governor's recommended budget, along with the unemployment insurance for classified staff that just came into effect. That is also a cost for districts that we're trying to incorporate before the governor finalizes her current service level. So that was a lot.
That was a lot. Very technical. And I'm not going to even ask what PERS side accounts are. That's for another discussion. The way I understand CSL, it's basically in the budget negotiations, it's the starting number. At what number do we start and say, this is what we need to just maintain, and then we figure out where can we go. And obviously, if the lower the starting number is, the worse negotiation position is. And if it's not accurate, it's not accurate. Kind of the other end of the spectrum is probably the QEM. And in August, there was a new QEM report to talk about how much money do we need for quality education in Oregon. Do you have any takeaways from that new report that you can already share?
Yeah. Great question. And this is something that at the Oregon School Boards Association website, we have a staff reporter and news specialist who releases a lot of stories. I will point that to you as a resource. And we have a story on the QEM's release that you might be interested in reading. How we see that release, again, talking about the current service level process, is Usually, without this current process that we went in getting a more accurate number, we would be going into the legislative session playing defense, trying to get that number to what we think it will be. With this governor's process and getting that CSL to a more accurate number, that means we pretty much have it covered. Again, we have a few things we're trying to work in as she finalizes her budget, but we got a more accurate CSL, or the best that we could do this cycle. What that means now when we go into legislative session with this QEM release, which again, it was the narrowest gap that we've had in a long time, 20% between what the governor's CSL would be about and what the Quality Education Commission recommended. 20% is still a lot, but it's better than we've ever had, and that's progress. How we see that is, again, when we're going in fighting over, is your number accurate, is this number, we are fighting for the status quo. Again, CSL is what you did last biennium rolled up into the next. That is not what we should be doing for our students. It's not what our students need. It's not what Oregonians expect our education system to do. It is doing the same. And I don't think anybody in this room, or anybody, no matter your party affiliation, where you live in the state, if you have kids, if you don't, nobody is happy with our current education system. And so when we're in there advocating for a status quo budget, which is what CSL is, that does not mean that we can be fighting for what we should be fighting for, which is a high quality education for each student in Oregon. And that is what the QEM is. So how we see going into next legislative session with that release is that the current service level makes us have a good starting place. And now it's going to take board members, superintendents, administrative staff, teachers, folks in this room to be able to advocate for what our schools need. So that way we can be having that conversation in the legislature. And the folks that publish the QEM, the Quality Education Model, is the Quality Education Commission, made up of folks across the state who use their professional expertise along with some support from ODE to develop that report and put stuff in a model to be able to get a number. And all of those numbers are in the release of the report.
And if you want to know more about the QEM, we had John Rexford, who is the chair of the Quality Education Commission, speak to us a few months ago, and I'll share the recording in my follow-up with everyone. So you can listen to him explain what that is and kind of where the issues with the QEM are from his perspective. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the role of school boards. Currently, I think we all agree the state is not giving enough funding to our districts. So how do school boards work with the insufficient funding? How do they set priorities? What should people know about the school board role there?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, of course. And I think what I would say is school boards are local governments that the buck stops with the board, right? They set policy and direction, they hire a superintendent, and they have to deal with what the legislature gives them in terms of resources, but have the mandate to serve every student that comes through their doors. It is a hard job, often thankless job. And when I think about my members, I think about a lot of the PTA folks in this room, is you care. You are volunteering your time to devote to something greater than yourself, which is public education, right? And so our board members come in active, they care about their community, they care about public schools, and then they get there, and then their responsibility is to govern. And unless they have a local operating levy, the dollars that come to them are from the legislature. And so as we've seen in all of these tough bargaining environments, is our board members are operating within the resources that they have. It's not to say that they don't want to pay teachers better or have the best facilities in the world or have, you name it, for our students to meet their needs. Unfortunately, they have to work within the confines of their budget, and they have fiduciary responsibilities to make sure that that district is viable over the long term. So that means they have to make tough decisions on budget. And we're seeing that, with the PPS strike, or, with Ben Lapine, for example, they saw that their budget, they were going to have to make some big cuts, but they had a local option levy that they put on the ballot, a teacher's levy, and it failed. And with that, they were counting on that to pay for a lot of teachers and prevent some reductions in staff. And with that feeling, that means that they're going to have to make those tough decisions. Because again, the buck stops with the board. They have to work within their budgets, and some have had to spend down reserves and are now in a perilous situation now that they have to make further cuts because they've been dipping into their financial reserves to help mitigate staff being cut or other things, which also isn't good for the district. So that's a little bit of the tough situation that board members are in, and why they're so activated in the next legislative session to try to get the funding they need. Because at the end of the day, those decisions are really difficult, but at the end of the day, it impacts the student. It impacts the care that they're getting, the quality of education, the facilities that they're in. And the legislature can be isolated from those challenges, right? And so it's our job to share these needs, share these challenges with them so they understand. They understand the need, they understand the tough decisions and choices that board members have to make. And instead of pointing fingers, they should be locking hands and saying, what can I do to support you and your district? And that's really what we're trying to do ahead of the next legislative session.
And what's a good way, when boards are making those tough budget decisions, what's a good way for families in that district to engage with their board members?
You know, I know if some of my board members here could speak, I know that they would love to jump in, but I think, you know, what I would say, and again, going back to the Portland teacher strike, is there was a lot of challenges there with folks being misaligned on what the facts were. Is folks thought that there was more money than there was. And when the board members are going in trying their best to create a budget that not only it sustains the district, but also tries their best to meet the needs of the teachers who are doing the work day in and day out, sometimes that can be a real challenge if folks aren't seeing the same facts. And that is why Governor Kotek brought her budget experts in to try to clear some of that up. So I think it is, of course, important to support the teachers who are doing the work, but I also think it's important for parents to pay attention to those board meetings and really listen when a board member is saying, I cannot do that because of this. I know that they are coming from a place of they are volunteering their time and they care about what's best for their district. And if they're saying, I cannot do that, and they're really firm on it, they probably have a good reason, and it's probably worthwhile to hear them out on that and listen before you start getting really angry. And at times it is important to be angry, but always remember the board did not set what their budget is, the legislature did. And so if there's any anger that should be set on a school district not having enough funding, that's why we should be advocating in the Capitol to get the resources that we need, because ultimately that came from the legislature, and the school district is doing the best within their means.
One thing the legislator likes to talk about is we as legislator only control the funding, but we're a local control state. We don't control how the money is spent, if it is spent well. I personally struggle a little bit with that argument because, like OSBA together with COSA, at the end of each session, you put out a report of all the bills that are going to affect school districts. And like in the short session, out of 135 bills that passed, 28 or so affected school districts. In 2013, there were over 100 state bills that passed that affect school districts. That does not really sound like local control, hands-off approach. How do you see that?
Oh, Robin, what a question. You know what I would say to that, and I have to answer that question a lot when a legislator says that. And I would just say, again, school districts are local governments. They were elected by their constituents to provide governance to that district. It is within their decision. Every district looks different. We have districts that are huge and we have some that are really, really small. One thing that works for that small district might not work for that big district or vice versa. And that is the nature of living in a diverse geographic state like Oregon has, where population is dispersed. And so when the legislature is trying to pass something that's one size fits all and then says, why aren't you spending it correctly? They're saying the wrong thing. The legislature can passes a budget, and they can set expectations for what schools should do with that funding or other things, because Oregonians also elected them to their positions. But when they're starting to talk about spending, legislators just are not equipped as school board members, administrators, or other folks who are running a district like a business manager to know what are the financial challenges or what are the things that work actually on the ground. Legislators just might not be as equipped as a board member or another administrator to be able to do that. And so I bristle a little bit when they talk about being accountable to spending, because really the question is, you're setting, again, like you said, Robin, they pass hundreds of bills and a lot of them are unfunded mandates, and then they say, why aren't you spending it correctly? Well, because you didn't give us enough in the first place, or you passed a bill that just doesn't work, or there's all these other challenges. And so that can be a challenge at times, because the legislature has a role and school boards have a role and local communities have a role in influencing and electing that school board. Adrienne, were you going to add something?
Well, and I'll also just say, that's the importance of telling stories of, of the PTA, parents, family, and school board members to tell stories of their particular districts to really frame, what we're talking about when we're speaking to legislators, either having a meeting with them or shooting them an email or something. And so that we're not just talking about these big numbers that are really hard to grapple with and understand, but really breaking down, like, this is what is happening in my small local district. These are the positive stories. These are, not necessarily the negative stories, but this is where we, need more funding or something like that. But really just framing it for the legislator so that they know that essentially where their money is going or where their money needs to go. But the storytelling is really the most important part.
Yeah. And I'd say, the last thing on this is, they say we're not accountable to spending, but they're not accountable to their own agendas or priorities because they switch them up all the time. And it's hard to change 197 districts that educate over 550,000 Oregon students. And if one session they make a change and we're just starting to implement it, and then they make a change again, that creates a lot of instability for districts and leads to a lot of challenges on the ground in actually implementing those things. So again, they can say, why aren't you spending it this way? Why aren't you doing that? But it's really, why do they keep moving the goalposts or adding another thing without providing the resources to be able to make it happen? That's really what we should be asking the question back to them in those situations.
Another thing I often hear from legislators is, if you want more money, we'll need more accountability. And I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yes. So again, it goes back to unfunded mandates where they set an expectation, but they don't provide the supports to actually make it happen. Or they say, maybe something that if we did it right would take 5 years, and they say, why didn't you do it in 1 year? Why didn't you do it in 6 months? Because it took 6 months for the bill to be implemented. And so I think that's the tricky place that we're in right now. The Oregon Department of Education, as a result of a bill from the 2023 session, has convened a table to talk about Oregon's accountability system. And I think that there are parts that are true, that if Oregonians invest their tax dollars in our schools and they want certain outcomes for students, they want students to graduate, be able to read, be able to do math, be able to be prepared for the workforce, those are legitimate expectations that the legislature would have of schools and want schools to be accountable to those outcomes. However, districts cannot be held to those standards if they are not being provided the resources to be able to make that happen. If they're saying, why aren't you doing this? But to do that means having caring adults, high quality teachers, maybe lower class sizes or other student supports for a student who their learning might not be when at a lecture hall, that they need one-on-one support or peer mentoring or after school tutoring, that those are the levels of interventions that we would need to be able to boost those rates to what Oregonians would want from their school system, what you all would want to see in your school system. So I think accountability based on that is important. But if they're talking about accountability to spending, or why did you do this and not that, not do that, that is, it changes based on their community what that looks like. And so being accountable in that way just doesn't make sense. That's something that we'd fight really strongly against. And I know my board members would be really activated on that front. But really, it's also in terms of accountability, and what we are trying to push back against is top-down accountability doesn't work. No Child Left Behind and the accountability measures in there did not foster what we want to see in our schools. That just doesn't work. Somebody in Salem saying, I looked at your report, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Doesn't work. We have to have an education system where school board members, teachers, and administrators can say, I see this challenge, I want to make it happen, and they should be able to have the resources to do that. I have a perfect example. In the last legislative session, there was a bill which I think had a lot of good intentions, and it passed. It was a bill to fund resource navigators in schools to provide support to foster youth, because foster youth have very disproportionate outcomes when it comes to graduation rates, test scores, attendance, all of that. And that was brought forward by a legislator who chaired at the time the joint Ed Sub, the Ways and Means Committee on Education, and she brought this bill forward because she saw some challenges. And what I would say is, if we had the resources, if we really had a high quality, adequate funding level for our schools, a district could say, I have a lot of foster youth in my school and they have needs. And so I'm going to pay for an additional staff to be able to provide that support to those students. That is, they see, I'm accountable to these numbers. These foster youth aren't performing. I'm going to do something that fits my local context. Instead, that took a bill to be passed to do a pilot study that has all of these paperwork and reporting to see if it worked. And so that's a way to improve. I see these poor performance measures for foster youth. Rightly so, we want to help raise them. But that level of accountability with those dollars, with all those strings attached to only a few districts, just doesn't make sense. And so it really is about how can we have a ground up continuous improvement system that has the leeway within a district because they have enough funding to be able to meet those local community needs.
Thank you. And I think that's also a part where parents and families in that school and school district can play a really important role to identify and help troubleshoot and figure out what works. There are two areas of funding I want to talk about a little bit more because they're special. And one is special ed, which is underfunded from the federal government down. What are your thoughts on special ed funding in particular?
Special ed is an area that we've had a lot of focus on in the legislature, and school districts are really having students coming back with increasing needs. How are we serving them? And it costs more and more to provide those specialists, those one-on-one attention, but also to be able to handle some difficult environments that can come up. Since the federal government passed the Individuals with Disabilities Act, many decades ago, they have not funded it to the level that they need. So that means that states are having to pick up the slack, because again, in terms of this accountability, the federal government sets very stringent standards, and they should, for how students with special needs or students with disabilities should receive a high quality education, just like anybody else. Schools serve everybody who comes through their doors. But if we do not fund it, then that means that those students are not being adequately served. And we have the same problem in Oregon with our state school funding model. When the state school funding model was passed many decades ago in the 1990s, they set an artificial cap on the special education weights, which are additional funding based on a student's need. And one of them is special education. They set it at 11%. Statewide, the average, because that was about the average at the time, and they said, this is the average at the time, we're just going to set it at 11%. That's pretty much how they made that decision.
And just to jump in to make sure people understand, school districts basically get funding based on the number of students, and there are some special categories of students. If you have students in a category, you get additional funding. Funding weights. So
that's with the special education weight. It is the only weight in the state school fund that has a cap. It is an arbitrary cap. Again, they said 11%, that's where it is now, let's set it there. Well, guess what? Since the 1990s, we've had more accurate diagnosis of students with disabilities. And so they have been able to get the supports they need. So now we have districts where some of it is at 20%. The statewide average is about 14%. So even on a statewide average, there is a couple percentage points gap. And that is huge. Right now, well, in the last legislative session, the chair of the House Education Committee brought forward these bills to lift and fund the cap, because we cannot just simply lift the cap on special education to say, okay, well, whatever amount of students you have in your district, you're going to receive these additional weights because we lifted the cap. That actually is not a good idea, because we have an equalization formula, which means if dollars are moving to one district without additional resources, it's just shuffling money around and creating winners and losers. So we have to.
The pie isn't big enough for
Yes.
special ed, and it doesn't really, obviously there are better ways to cut it, but as long as we don't grow the pie, we're always underfunded.
So we need to grow the pie. And in 2024, earlier this year, the estimates are about $350 million to lift and fund the cap. That is $350 million that our schools do not have as of 2024, and it is likely higher now. And imagine that compounded over time since the 1990s. It is, in my view, one of the reasons why, if we see high needs in serving special education students by workforce or other challenges, if we can't pay them enough, we can't get the specialists that they need because the district doesn't have enough budget, or they're taking away from one to serve these students, or the legislature adds even more mandates like Senate Bill 819 or others. That means districts are working within fewer and fewer dollars to serve those students. And so to get additional dollars without the federal government, footing the bill that they should, which earlier this year, we went to DC with school board members to advocate for that.
Is we as PTA.
And PTA and other organizations do it too, is we have to lift and fund the cap on special education weights in Oregon. And that is one of OSBA's top priorities. It is shared with other association partners, because if we're talking about serving these SPED students, we have to be able to resource schools to be able to support their success. And that is one way that we do that.
Another area that definitely doesn't have enough funding is facilities, school buildings, right? And their situation is even more complex and less equal around the state. If you could talk to that from your perspective.
So this is a huge challenge to districts that do not pass local bonds to be able to support their facilities improvements. So again, most of the districts across the state, unless they have a lot of local revenue from timber revenues, for example, or if they have a local operating levy that supports their budget, all of their funding comes from the federal government and the state school fund. And again, most of districts' costs, 80 to 90%, are personnel related. The students who are in schools serving students every single day. If the legislature is not allocating enough funds, there's only a small, and I have a graph, I wish I could show it to you today. There's only a small sliver in the state school fund that would go to facilities. And because we've been underfunded for decades, most of those dollars are used to make minor repairs so doors can stay open and not do the improvements that they need. So that means a lot of deferred maintenance. That's why we have tens of billions of dollars in maintenance backlogs and in school facilities that are needed of upgrades across the state, because that has compounded over time. So again, Robin, you mentioned there is inequities across the state in terms of school facilities. There are some that have phenomenal classrooms with gyms and all the other things that support extracurriculars. And then there's other ones that are keeping buckets under the roof when it rains, or it gets too hot, it's too cold. And if you're a perfect example was a town outside of Jervis who almost had to close if they did not pass a bond last time, because their facilities were in such dire straits that they did not feel comfortable sending students there. That is how the situation in some places. And so that is a big piece that our board members care about, of course, is equitable school facilities. What does it say to a student who's in one of those classrooms where there's bucket being, rain collected in a bucket? That says in that small rural community that the best days in that place might be behind them. That is not the message that we should be sending to students. And so that's why it's critical that we invest in facilities. OSBA over a decade ago worked to pass the awesome bond matching grants, which is a program to incentivize bonding by local districts. That allocation has remained unchanged, a little over $100 million for quite a few biennia. We're trying to go into the next legislative session to ask for more money so we can get more districts to get those funds, but it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge.
I want to switch over to our third big topic, looking forward to 2025. We've talked a little bit about a few things. We've talked about the special ed cap, facilities. What else do you see in terms of, especially in terms of school funding, coming up in the 2025 legislative session?
Yeah. So we talked about summer learning, we talked about the special education cap. I think the other in facilities, I think the other one that I would say, and of course, everybody's going to come in 2025 with what their ideas of what we should, fund for schools or pay for. I think one of the biggest ones, and this has really come from Governor Kotek and the legislature seeing, in Oregon and across the nation, are literacy rates, or especially during the pandemic, that students maybe didn't have the support that they needed to be on track. And so that's a big issue that the legislature invested in the last long session, and they're looking towards a more sustainable path to that. Now, we had a bunch of arguments in that session on how they pay for it, what that should look like. But in terms of a big funding ask that's going to come in 2025, that is likely another one. The sustainable path forward to that early literacy initiative of additional targeted dollars to support raising those literacy rates, supporting the workforce doing the work, or paying for high dosage tutoring, the things that are proven to support students getting, being able to read. That's another big thing that's likely to come in 2025. That will come. Adrienne, I don't know if there's anything else I'm missing. I know there is.
That specifically deals with funding, or just kind of in general?
Yeah, funding.
Mostly funding, but if you want to throw something out, if you have something important that's not funding related, I think that's also interesting to know as we're sitting here.
I mean, I think that there's conversations right now around chronic absenteeism, and there will definitely continue to be conversations in the 25 session around that and what we can do to support students to get in school and to stay in school. The rates of chronic absenteeism have nearly doubled since the pandemic. And that's not an Oregon thing. It's all across the country. Schools are grappling and trying to, figure out how to best support students. Why are they not coming to school? What types of things do they need inside school? Is it, food? Is it clean clothes? Is it, some other type of support so that they can stay in school? So there will definitely be a lot of conversations around, how we can get our chronic absenteeism rates down, what districts are doing right now that have low chronic absenteeism rates, and kind of, seeing what they're doing and, maybe modeling them or speaking to the educators there to try and implement that in our other school districts.
Is there something people should keep an eye out for, something that we might not want to have happen?
I mean, it depends.
That you can speak
I don't know.
publicly
I think it
about.
depends on what you want to see happen. I'd say something that we're dealing with now, and I'm sure everyone is seeing in the news, is around cell phones. Like, what are we going to do with students and cell phones in schools? There's, districts right now, PBS and Lake Oswego and North Clackamas, kind of all over, that are banning cell phones, whether it's from bell to bell, or, it has to be locked in a way, either in a Yonder packet, which are really expensive, or in a locker if they have lockers, and a backpack, or at the, the front of the classroom with the teacher. And so the legislature is kind of moving full steam ahead right now on a bill for that. That would, we don't know what the bill looks like, but it's likely going to be a full ban statewide. And we districts are already doing that, and they're creating policies that work for their particular district, and that's something that we would like to see continue, is districts handling this, because there's, implementation issues. There's who is going to be the one enforcing the ban, policing the ban, what's going to happen to students if they break the ban, like all of these questions that can't be answered at a state level, especially if it's not going to be funded. Like those yonder packets are thousands of dollars, like tens of thousands of dollars, right? And so we want to make sure that, this is, in our opinion, a district issue. Districts know how their schools are set up, what capacity their school has in order to do this, and whether the issue is a big issue in their particular school. So, but that is something that we're keeping an eye on, and for sure something that will come up and move forward in the 25 session.
Yeah, definitely a subject among parents as well. Um,
Yes.
Circling back to school funding, who should we be looking for in terms of leading on school funding? Who will be the Oregon champion for better funded schools?
I think one of the beautiful things about associations like the Oregon School Boards Association, the Coalition of School Administrators, or unions like OEA and OSCA is they represent the collective voice of thousands of people across the state. I represent over 1,400 school board members. There's over 40,000 teachers in OEA, and you name it. And so we represent their collective voice in Salem, and we advocate on their behalf. And so what we are doing is, how are we working together with a unified message where we're all locked arms together, and how are we going into 2025 to secure the resources that students need? Because we are only successful if we work together. The perfect example is the Student Success Act. Parents, community members, community-based organizations, and those associations like OSBA came together with allies in the legislature to make a big thing happen, get new revenue in for schools in 2019. That is the only way that we're able to move the needle with the legislature. And so in terms of where you can look to for leadership and guidance on that, we are in these conversations day in and day out. We're in the governor's CSL conversation. And I would say, please see us as a resource for those funding conversations. But really, where you all can be a resource to us and your local communities and your own individual advocacy is when we are in the Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee where the legislature decides what they're going to spend money on. We can be in there doing that work, but we need from you all is beating that drumbeat in your communities. And what does your community need? What do you want to see in your schools? Again, the legislature is making decisions because they were put there by Oregonians to represent them. And when the budget is established, the legislature says, what are their priorities? And in 2025, as in any budget cycle, we start with a clean slate. I mean, I wish we did. We don't. There's a lot of baggage and CSL and all that, but we start with something new. The legislature decides what are they going to invest in. So as much as we can provide that support, it's also going to take a lot of grassroots effort, organizing, lobbying, bringing the legislator to a community event, going to their coffee to say, what is the need? Because we're going to go in with an ask. You all might support an ask, but we need legislators to know what the need is. And that's where you all can come in.
Can you be a little bit more specific on how do families, advocates here on this call, what do you think we need to do to advocate?
Yep.
What's the most effective way for family, like the people that are not in Salem every day, how can they best support?
Yeah. And Adrienne, please jump in. But I would say the most important thing that we need to do right now is, I know we want to talk about CSL, we want to talk about QEM, but really legislators are paying attention. November is coming up. They're looking at the election, and they have a whole bunch of other people calling them to ask for money or say, hey, I have this priority, please invest in it. What we need right now is you all to engage with your local legislators, send them an email. I know you all are well served by Robin and everybody else in getting those messages out to legislators. And I know from my own individual contributions or conversations with legislators, they're talking about receiving emails from you all. They are seeing the issue. And I think parents have such unique insight into what their students are facing or what they need from their schools that you are well positioned to be able to share that story with the legislator. And in this window, before November and a little bit after, it's really highlighting that. What do you want to see from your schools? What maybe challenges are you seeing in your district that might benefit from more funding? That's what legislators need to hear. Because just as Adrienne said earlier, it's those stories that make an impact. I was in a meeting the other day in this large conference room and I said, if there was $10.2 billion in here, it would probably fit up this whole room. It's incomprehensible. We're talking about these big numbers, but what is individual stories of a student who's impacted or your experience in a public school system. And that's what legislators need to hear. So when they're looking at their priorities and what do they think they should pay for over something else, they know that schools need that funding to invest in. And then building up when we enter the long session, it's paying attention to your PTA folks here on this call or other associations in terms of how can you get activated? How can you support? How can you do that organizing on the ground to be able to say, this is the number that we're advocating for, what we need. We need summer learning, we need to lift the cap, we need to do all of those things. But right now it's imperative that we talk about the need. Adrienne, I don't know if I'm missing anything or you have anything to add.
I mean, I was just going to add like an extra layer, outside of contacting your legislator. And if you don't know how to do that, you can go on OLIS. They have a searching tool. It's very simple. But also being interactive with your school board and your school board members and telling them the stories because they're going to be doing similar things. They're going to be reaching out to their legislators. We're going to be asking, school board members to come to the Capitol either during lobby day or during a bill that we know that they have expertise in, and they're going to be relaying those stories. And so the more that you're interacting with your school board, telling them a specific incident about your student or their friends or, something that you would like to see happen, the more engaged you are, and vice versa, the school board members being engaged with you, that's just going to give us more energy and more information to give to the legislators when they're trying to make these big money decisions.
Thank you. So true. And definitely, because Oregon PTA always try and hopefully achieve being able to motivate and activate people and educate them how and organize to do all these things. And we continue to do that. I want to close with two short questions on a positive, hopeful note. And they're to both of you individually and personally. And the first one is, what is something that you like about Oregon Public Schools?
Being a graduate of Oregon Public Schools, I will say, what I really love about our public education system is not only it brings you in touch with your community, right? I went to elementary school with the folks I went to high school, and I graduated from McNary High School in Kaiser. And that sense of community that you have is really important. But I think the other thing is really dedicated teachers. I think we have some amazing teachers here in Oregon, and I would not be here without them seeing in this poor kid from Salem, Oregon, that there was some potential there. And that gift that they have gave to me and give to so many students across Oregon is that thing that makes Oregon special. It's a thing that says to a student, I am capable of learning. I am a young scholar. I can do good things with my life. And I think that that's what we want each student to feel. I was lucky enough to have it. I think there are not enough students that have that. And that's why we need to fight for those resources and supports in Salem, because we should not be not meeting the needs of our students. We need to meet them because amazing things happen, like someone being able to graduate and go to the Capitol and advocate on their behalf.
Adrienne.
Okay, I'm getting a signal that my internet is unstable, so hopefully you all can hear me. It's been cutting out in and out this whole webinar session. I would say my favorite thing, and Efren kind of touched on this a little bit, is the community. I volunteered at Grant High School in Portland for the past 6 years now, and getting to interact with the students, getting to interact with the alumni who come back. They come back every year to help us out, and the teacher who's a part of our program. It's just such an amazing thing to see this community of people rally around students and support them and, doing what they really like to do. And they're high school students, they could be doing anything, and they go off to college, they could be doing anything, but they come back and they really support each other. And so that's just been one of my favorite things to see is the community at all of the schools.
And what is something you would love for more schools to have? What would you like to see more of?
I think I would like to see, and I've heard this time and time again when students have came and spoke at a panel, is more extracurricular activities or more opportunities for folks to learn outside of a classroom and CTE courses or something else, because that can really make a difference. It's where students can focus on what they're passionate about. Maybe they're not as passionate about learning math, but they're really excited to come and be able to work with Adrienne in an after school program to learn about, law or something like that. That's what gets them there. Because districts had to do a lot of cuts after 2008, some haven't even fully recovered from that. And so that is something I hear from students a lot. And I think if we had more funding to be able to provide those opportunities, that would be really good.
I should have went first because that was my answer. No, definitely more extracurricular activities. During legislative days that we have in the even years, back in May, there was a group of students that came in from a robotics club, and they brought their giant. I'm not a robotics person, so it was a giant robot. But the students had built it, and they were talking about their experience in the club, and there were a few students that spoke about how they were super shy. They didn't make any friends in high school. They just felt like a complete outcast. And then their school got this robotics club and they wanted to come to school. They wanted to be a part of this club. Like that's what got them in the door. And so really giving kids opportunities outside of the classroom to engage, with volunteers or with someone who, whatever your interest may be, giving them that opportunity. And that really sets them up for the future. Not only does it help them graduate, but it really sets them up for the future. And so I would love, love, love to see more extracurricular activities in schools.
Thank you both, Adrienne and Efren. Thank you so, so much for your insights, your knowledge, for sharing that with us, and for being here tonight. We're unfortunately out of time, so I have to stop here. I want to make a couple of announcements. There we go, sharing my screen again. If you're interested in more details on school funding, we put together a document linking to a lot of resources. I'll put the link in the chat that you can check out and continue. If you have resources you would like us to add or have ideas how we can help people better understand what's going on in education funding, I'd love to hear it. legislation@oregonpta.org. We also very recently this week updated our Oregon PTA website with our advocacy resources. Feel free to check that out. That's oregonpta.org/advocacy, or go through our menu and check out what PTA is all about. And then we have already our next episode scheduled, and it's going to be a bit sooner than usual. It's going to be September 10th. And we have folks from Foundations for a Better Oregon who looked at the Student Success Act, which passed 5 years ago, and they did a study looking back to look forward, kind of what worked with the Student Success Act, what are things that should be still improved. We'll have that on September 10th, on here at 7:30 as usual. If you're not registered and you're not getting my email so far for the series, I'll put the link in the chat so you can do that. Feel free to share, invite people. I'll send the recording probably tomorrow with further information. And with that, I want to thank you all, and I'll stop the recording now. And again, thank you to our guests. And